when it comes to money, many people have said there's spenders and there's savers. And so let's out each other right now. Who is a spender? Some of you are lying. Who is a saver? Yeah, until there's a good sale, right? That's kind of how it works, right? I think, and probably like those of you that are in relationship, married, do you marry the opposite? Is that how it sometimes works? Do you find if you're a spender, do you like, I need a saver, or we're done, or vice versa, right? Yeah, I think there's probably seasons for both too. I think there's some smarts involved in that. I think I'm a spender. You probably can tell. You're like, yeah, you are. We can tell. I love buying stuff and things and things and stuff. Like I'm just into that. But I've worked on saving. I think I've matured as the hair has gone. The savings have increased. You know, is that how it goes? There's something about wisdom. Maybe it's for the gray hair. Anyway. That's another story, but for like 7 years or so now, I've used this app on my phone called EveryDollar, and it's been super, super helpful. It's basically budgeting, but it makes it easy to track, and so I started tracking things. I mean, since I've had a car, like, I'm not at the level of my uncle. My uncle has a little book where, whether pencil or pen, he's marked like every transaction since he first started driving, like in the 60s, I think. Like he could tell you, oh yeah, the gas used to be this much, and I went to the Texaco and I got gas here. You know, he could probably tell you that. I could go back at least 7 years and tell you what I spent at Costco or Irving or wherever. I could definitely do that. Gas receipts, no problem. Coffee spending. How many of you buy coffee like at least a couple times a week? How many? A few more times than that, yeah. So I had to look at like coffee spending, and I'm realizing that now these are American stats, but the average working American spends like $1,000 at coffee shops just for coffee itself a year. That might not shock some of you, but like $1,000 a year on coffee. We know it's important, right? But I definitely decreased some of that when I started making espresso at home. But then obviously it increased when the landing went in right here. So it's like, I'll just walk over and get coffee, right? Every day. Every day. So, you know, budgeting, it helps, especially to justify spending, right? Because then it's like, oh, it's in the budget. It's in the budget. So we've been in this series called Starting Lines all year. It's now March. It's time to come to a close. I know that you guys are like, are you serious? You're still in Starting Lines? This is the very last day, and there was applause. It was forced, but there was applause. But we do believe every next step in your faith journey is really like a new starting line. And so hopefully there's been some things that are implied and then some things that are explicit throughout the series. And for today, what we're really talking about, not a finish line, so to speak, it's still a starting line. But have you heard this before? Sometimes the very last thing to be converted is the wallet. That's sometimes the case. I don't know if you can picture this. This is borderline like wrong to just think about, but I think it's kind of true too. So can you picture someone like, imagine they're in the tank or they're in the Nash walk, and just before, you know, they're getting ready to plug their nose, and they grab their wallet and they hold it above the water as they go under it. Can you picture that? Just the pastor's picturing that? Okay, you guys are liars. You need some help. I'm going to preach to you today. Listen. I think I can picture that because I think it's true that sometimes the wallet doesn't make it under the water. Not that you should Ziploc it if it's going to be in your pants, just for the record. Usually people are taking phones and keys out, handing it to someone to take care of. But this is the thing. Jesus talked about money a lot. And a lot would be like a quarter of what he taught on was on money. That's a lot. So if you're new and visiting here today, we're not going to have a quarter of our sermons about money, so you can rest assured. But our passage today is from maybe the most famous sermon there is, the Sermon on the Mount. And so for context, Jesus, maybe the greatest teacher, yes, the greatest teacher ever, he ends up going up on this mountainside, and he sat down to teach, and his disciples and others gathered around, and then all of a sudden there are crowds. And I've noticed this, and in your reading, find a time, I think there's one time, but find a time and then tell me if you find a time where he's not sitting down to teach. It was a common thing for rabbis of the day, but just picture that. We're looking at him sitting in a boat right now. He's sitting on a mountainside, and he begins to teach. And we're just going to take an excerpt of that. We're not going to take his whole sermon, but starting in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19, Jesus says, "Don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal." And maybe some of you have this highlighted. "Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also." Your eye is a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is good, the whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Father, we thank you for your message and even this excerpt from the Sermon on the Mount. And there must be a good reason that you would talk about money and possessions so much. And would you just help us to understand what it is you have for us today? And as awkward as it can be, would you illuminate something for us, for those of us that are younger and still figuring things out? Would you teach us what we need to know? Those of us that are a little bit older and should know better, would you still instruct us and help us to know what we should know and have a better perspective from your point of view, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The second rule is you do not talk about Fight Club. 10 of you know the reference from a book or a movie with Brad Pitt. Probably the movie with Brad Pitt. It's a little old now, but the second most famous kind of line or quotable part of that is, "The things you own end up owning you." Have you heard that? You at least know that to be true. Sometimes that's kind of how things look. I think we could probably summarize Western consumer culture this way: we buy stuff we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. True. We don't need the stuff, but we buy it, and often, basically since after one of the great wars, credit cards became a thing, and now it would be weird to not have one, right? And how many of you have watched Saturday Night Live once in the last 50 years? It's now 50 years going, right? It's pretty crazy. Some of you don't stay up that late. Some of you, it shows that you stayed up that late to watch it. But Steve Martin, he's one of the greats that's hosted it. I think he's in second place for all time, maybe, but he got to host the special 50th there a couple weeks ago. But years ago, he was in this sketch, called "Don't Buy Stuff." And if you haven't heard it, I'm going to just explain just what I think is the best part of it. But it's kind of hilarious. He and Amy Poehler are sitting as though they're at a kitchen table like a married couple might do. And they're kind of, just commenting about how it's hard to get the numbers to add up. Have you ever been there? At least you understand the context. They're trying to figure out, how are we going to get ahead of this, And all of a sudden, there's this man that kind of walks in between, and he's standing kind of behind them. And he's got this book and this program. It's called "Don't Buy Stuff You Cannot Afford." It's a great little book, and it should be real. But they kind of poke fun at things that especially Americans and even some of us Canadians kind of think about. And I think it still holds up. So you can picture he's holding this little book, and so she's like kind of interested, and she grabs it, and she reads this line: "If you don't have any money, you should not buy anything." And it's kind of like, oh, that's interesting, And Steve Martin's like, that's kind of confusing. Like, what do you mean, right? And so I just want to share a couple of the interactions. So first, she's like, okay, what if I want something but I don't have the money? That's a great question. What do you think the answer is, right? You don't buy it, right? Because you don't have the money. But then Amy says, what if you have the money? Can you buy it then? And the guy's like, yes. And she's like, now take the money away. Same story, right? And it's like, nope, you shouldn't buy stuff when you don't have the money. And that really, we could end there and be like, all right, I think I know enough about money, you know? And so the real kicker is that Steve doesn't really get it. And he's saying something that it sounds funny because it should, but we also kind of feel the tension, at least some of us, those of us that are spenders. He's essentially saying that, well, shouldn't I buy something I want and then hope I can pay for it later? And it's like, no, that's obviously the opposite of what we think and the opposite of what we see even in Scripture. It's a funny interaction that I think holds up 20 years later. I think it'll always hold up. But we know this to be true. We know that money isn't really a math problem. It's not about just getting the numbers to add up. When we want something, at least some of us know that it's the emotions that take over. It's the habits that kind of win the day. It's the stories we tell ourselves about money that end up kind of influencing what we're going to do. And so unless you break that, you're going to keep doing the same old thing. I grew up in the real John Sherwood's household, and this year, if he was still alive, he would be 100 this year, which is just crazy to me. So I grew up with someone who grew up during the Great Depression. So if he sent me to the store for milk that was on sale and I got the wrong one, I was in trouble. It was a dime, but to him, that was like $1 million. And so I kind of grew up with that sense of like, no, you know, and my grandmother said things like, now this isn't relevant today, but when she was alive, it was. It's like, if you take care of the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves. So I grew up with old people, you know, so I have a little bit of that in me. But there's this guy, this Italian, his last name Pareto. He observed something in Italy, and it's something that then people started noticing in other facets of life. He noticed, we call it now either the 80-20 principle or the 80-20 rule. People have talked about it in business management, but first how he discovered it is that he noticed that about 20% of the people in Italy owned about 80% of the land. That sounds kind of absurd. I've been there, and it's true. The mafia obviously owns about half of that. But aside from that, they're going to strike me now. It's a problem. But anyway, we'll pray for protection. But Pareto noticed this. He noticed that about 20% of the people owned about 80% of the land. And then he started noticing it showing up in other places. Other people have kind of taken that and used it for different things, as I mentioned. So we often would say 20% of the people do about 80% of the work. That's kind of a truism anyway. It's approximate. But only about 20% would understand statistics, right? So that's the rest of us, right? Something that Dave Ramsey says, and he's all about financial peace, all about personal finance, budgets, and things like that. He rants on the radio. He has a YouTube channel, all those things. But the one thing that he says that is just true using this principle is that personal finance is 80% behavior and only about 20% math or head knowledge. That's kind of shocking, isn't it? The actual know-how only takes up a small percentage, but then the rest of it is really the behavior, the way that we act on that knowledge. And we know this to be true, right? That math, it isn't really a math problem. Money really isn't a math problem, at least not entirely. So we're going to look at kind of 3 areas today. The first is, you could call it like a path for transformation. It's a thing I observed recently when it comes to teaching, and sometimes you could see whether it's a parable or something else that Jesus is teaching especially. Think of it this way, that the teaching, it can start in the head. It can start with kind of that knowledge and trying to dissect things just cognitively. But then it actually moves. Jesus wants to move it to the heart, right? So then there's actually some emotion attached to it. There's some transformation that can take place. And then finally, that teaching will lead to the hands. There's action required, not just a perspective change and not just emotional response, but action. Do you get that? The head, the heart, the hands. With me? That's how teaching kind of works. I think financial wisdom could be this way too, that it starts in the head. Yeah, the maths are important. The numbers are part of the whole thing, like dollars and cents should make sense. But shouldn't it then move to the heart? Obviously, some of us have felt on one side or the other, especially if we've been in a situation, a crisis, or with a family member who's gone through something, and financially things are dire, that affects the heart right away. The head doesn't matter, the hands don't matter, So we understand that, but it should move to the heart, but then obviously lead to the hands, to action, to behavior, you could say that. So in the head, it's an understanding that we need to kind of glean, sure, learning financial wisdom, but it's the heart that needs to be transformed, really aligning our values with God's. If Jesus is communicating like a quarter of his teaching to money and possessions, there must be something, not just in the ancient culture, but maybe even in our modern culture. I think Steve Martin, kind of got that, and that's why they poked fun of it. But it should lead to our hands, to actually the action of both living generously and wisely, right? It should lead to how we use our wallets, whether they're digital or leather or whatever. So I think, at least for me, my perspective, I'm speaking for us as a moment, that I think we want to see things through God's eyes. I think we should. And it's not just about changing habits. It's really about transforming our hearts. I think all the things that we've talked about this year so far, everything from especially Mark, and going through the starting lines things, I think it's something that has to change. The posture of our heart is a phrase we often use, that if things change there, it will come out in actions eventually. It needs to. And I think in this case, we're going to see that really the wallet follows our heart. The heart really follows what we truly value. But just before we move on, I don't think that Jesus wants our wallet just for the sake of saying it, but what he does want, implies it, is that he wants our whole selves. He wants all of us. He wants you. He wants you completely. The head, the heart, the hands. That's our understanding, you could say our desires, our actions. He wants all of us to be aligned with God's kingdom. And again, sometimes the wallet is the last piece of the puzzle. The second kind of framing that I want you to see is maybe a change of perspective. You could say store, see, and serve. It comes right out of part of the passage, the excerpt that we just had. And so particularly it's where we store, how we see, and who we serve. Can you say where? Can you say how? Can you say who? I could get you to say something else, I won't, but where we store, I think part of the passage, it just makes sense. If we're just looking at it literally, he's saying like where we store stuff, like that matters. And then how we see things, that also matters. And then who we serve is kind of the last thing that we looked at. So that's what we're going to look at, the where, the how, the who. Well, the store, where we store our money, where we store our possessions, our valuables, where we store our treasure determines where our heart is. That's why that matters. Okay, so what we see and how we see, it actually affects how we use it, how we put it into practice. So our perspective, not just our literal eyes, but as in how we see things. If we can see things through good eyes, if God gives us that perspective, that should affect how we see money and everything else. But then ultimately what we're getting to today is who we serve. Who, or it seems like a what, but the serve is the who we serve. It says really God or money. When I was reading from my Bible, occasionally there's some wording that is different from maybe the screen or the printed Bible, because sometimes there's different versions, there's updates on language. In the one that I printed from YouVersion for my reading purposes, actually says you cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. It has a little bit of a heavier tone to it, because who we serve really determines our freedom or not. I think that's where we see the tension. As I've read in the Message before, Eugene Peterson kind of phrases it this way: you can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. And here's the final line: you can't worship God and money both. I think the idea here is that, have you ever heard that phrase, like, he who chases two rabbits gets neither? Something like that. You know what I mean? It's an old, I think, Japanese saying that we've tried to convert into English. But if you're trying to chase two things at once, you can't, right? You can't actually do that. But the last thing that I really want to share, the last kind of perspective is actually where the heart belongs. I think right in the core, right in the kind of center of this, speaks to where our heart and implies where our heart should belong. When I'm using my Bible, some of the pages are marked up more than others, but do any of you write in the margins? Do any of you write at the top, the bottom, underline? Any of you? Yeah, bobblehead church, right? Yeah, that's good. There's something that I wrote a while back when I was in this. I put symbols so that I could easily note them and kind of put them next to a few verses. I have a dollar sign for eternal. I have a heart for internal. And then I have the cross representing eternal. And so there's external, internal, and eternal. And so as I'm reading, I kind of see that I've previously noted. So when I was reading, I did my study first, and then I was like, oh, wait, why did I do that again? And so I had to go back and kind of realize what it was for. So those three symbols, you could think of the external. I think it's obvious here, but especially in verse 19, you could see money or possessions being the content. Verse 19, it's really saying, don't store up treasures here on earth. It's talking about treasures, could be gold. I think there's some people that, wasn't there a rumor of trying to break into Fort Knox? Weren't they looking at that even this week? I know that there's some people that think, like, if I have some gold bars and everything goes sideways, like, we can melt it down, right? I don't know how you're going to do that, but anyway, apparently gold's still a standard. When it comes to internal, the heart, you'll see that it's heart, it's desire. Verse 21, you could say, it says this, where your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. And it's also saying that that essentially this is the internal. This is something that could end up being eternal, right? But the actual eternal, the lasting investment, you could call it. I have the cross next to that, and it's saying really here in verse 20, store up your treasures in heaven. And I think that there's a bit of tension here. Obviously, it comes a little bit later. Another symbol and another in my kind of margin here, but I feel like the tension of it for us today is that the heart is kind of caught between the external and the eternal. It's kind of right there in the middle. I think that's a tension, that it feels like we have to manage it. But what if we could determine that instead of the heart leaning towards the external, it actually fit the eternal? This is what I mean, is that Jesus, he's not just talking about money and possessions. He's talking about your heart. And he's talking about where your heart, not just where your treasure will be, but kind of implying where your heart will be. Maybe you could think of it this way. If our heart is too attached to the external, it can't fully connect to the eternal. Or at least there's a disconnect somewhere. What we do with our money and our possessions, it's not just a financial decision, is it? It's a spiritual one. I was thinking of it this way. Do I trust what I can hold on to or what holds me? Which do I trust? That's something that I need to kind of wrestle with. But I think you can see here, because if we were to look, if this was a course and we had more time to jump around a little bit, you could see that Jesus, he's not really saying don't save. I think saving is wise and biblical, and we don't need to go into all the references today. You can probably see that that's true. But he is saying don't store up treasure on earth, store treasure in heaven. So what does it mean to store treasure in heaven? It could mean a few things. I think there's some implications you can guess without it being an exhaustive kind of list or overview. Investing in God's work, I think that's part of storing treasure in heaven, which it's something that the heart is meant to not just be internal, but it's supposed to become eternal, right? And so investing in life change, things like that would be part of storing up treasure in heaven. It's an investment, not just for the future, but for eternity, right? It could mean that. It could mean living with open hands. That's one of those sayings that people use where you can kind of picture open hands, literally freely giving, freely receiving, just kind of being open, not stingy. I was thinking about this. If you said stingy Christian, wouldn't that be an oxymoron? Wouldn't that be the opposite of the values of Christ, to be stingy, right? So, It's past Christmas, but you remember Scrooge, right? Like, he needed a heart change. Sometimes we do too, even if we're not miserly like that, but we need to live with open hands. And it probably indefinitely means practicing generosity. We see that not just through the life and the teachings of Jesus, but we see throughout the New Testament that practice of generosity. And so just before we close, I just want you to know this, and the team's just about to come to lead in a final song, but you might think this is about money, and sometimes when someone starts talking about it, teaching on it, it feels like, oh, they're after my money. They want to tell me to give and all these things. But you might think that it's about money. It is, but it's also about surrender. It's also about surrender. I think this is the truth from this, is that surrender to God, we've seen this to be true. Surrender to God brings freedom. Surrender to money leads to slavery. That's the truth of it. And the tension here is that you will surrender to one and you cannot serve both. That's the tension here that I think Jesus wants us to uncover in just this short little thing. There's more to it, but for today what we're looking at is that I believe that surrendering to God, as in our full selves, and if that includes that wallet that might have been kept above the water line, that might be part of it. But there's freedom in surrendering to Him, and you can't serve both. That's true. Actually, in ancient slavery, they wouldn't allow partial service. You couldn't have a part-time gig with one master and then another. Like, that just didn't work. And so when Jesus says it, it's pretty clear. There's no one questioning what He meant. It means this: you have to be completely under one and not partially shared between two. And so when it says you can't do both, they're at opposing ends. You can serve God and use money as a tool, but you can't be enslaved to money and serve God. Does that make sense? You can't do both. So just a couple questions as we're closing. I think the first two are the same question in different ways, so I hope that it helps. If surrender leads to freedom, what's one area of your life that you're still holding on to? What's that one area? Thinking back to that analogy of you're going under the water, or someone's going under and they're holding the wallet with a tight fist above the water line. What parts of your life have you kept above the water line? Is there something else? Maybe it's not the wallet. Maybe for you it's something else. But there is something, isn't there? Another way to say it is, if someone you trusted, I'm thinking about tax time, and some of you have an accountant. If someone was looking at your accounts and from everything from your T4 to your charitable giving to other things that you've done, imagine if they could look at all your financial records in the last year. Would they know where your heart really is? I think they'd have an indication of that, right? Would they say they know what your heart treasures? And would it be the things of God? Would it be things that He wants? As we're wrapping up this series, we're right there. We're at the finish line of starting lines, right? You got to remember that money, this could be the beginning of a journey. For me, 7 years ago, I kind of joked about it, but for real, getting a grip on the budget made a world of difference. It took a little while to get into that practice, but practically speaking, that's not even a spiritual thing. That's just a thing. Is that it just made such a difference. If I could have told my 16, 17, 18-year-old self, like, get this up, it might not have existed back then, but like, figure this out, like it would have radically changed the rest of my life, So for some of us, you've got to realize the next step could be even just creating a budget. That's not really a hard thing to see here. It might be that. For others, it might be giving generously. But for someone, it might be that you're following Jesus. You know that you should follow Him. You know that freedom, true life is found in Him, but you haven't fully surrendered. There's still something you're holding on to. Whatever that might be, you need to let go of that. But realize that God, He's not after your wallet. He's after your heart. The whole thing. And so whatever it is, I'd ask you to consider. I would encourage you strongly to take that next step. Surrender to Him always leads to freedom. So the question isn't whether you'll surrender, but it's who or what you'll surrender to. And only one master leads to true freedom.